Okay, so welcome to the Bat Chat, everyone. Today we've got a tale of three caves saving Hildegarde's tomb bat in Kenya. While everyone's starting to filter in, we'd love to know where you're watching from. So pop into the chat on whatever platform you're watching on and let us know where you're watching from. It's a little business here. If you're on Zoom and you'd like subtitles while you watch the webinar, you can click on show captions at the bottom of your screen or by clicking the more button with the three dots. So with us today is Dr. Isabella Mandl, BCI's Regional Director of Africa and South Asia. Isabella has been working on research projects to support the protection of threatened species on Madagascar and Comoros since 2013. She's a passionate conservation biologist who, besides highlighting the importance of working with local communities, believes that understanding animal behavior is a key component for successful conservation management. After the presentation, Isabella will have time to answer your questions. So you can type those in the Q&A box if you're on Zoom, or type them into the comments if you're watching on another platform. So hello, Isabella.
Hi, Linda, and thank you for the introduction. So if we're all ready, I would just start. So yeah, I was introduced in great detail, so I don't have to do that again. But I've been working in a couple of African countries now, trying to protect bats from extinction in those countries. And today I'll be telling a little story about how BCI sort of ended up working in Kenya. And to start that story, you sort of have to start with the team. So I'm going to take the chance here to introduce a couple of my colleagues from Kenya. To my right in the picture, so on the right of the picture is Dr. David Vichuli, who is our Kenyan program manager. And to the left of the picture, standing there, is Dr. Paul Vibala, who is a bat expert and basically the go-to guy for any East African bat questions. And Paul has been working on bats for decades. I can't really say how long. I don't want to age him, but he's basically been highlighting lots of issues and needs that the bats in Africa have been facing in the last few decades. And during a visit there at the coast of Kenya in 2022, me and Paul got to talking about the situation, and we ended up actually having a very long discussion with members of the local community on the coast about the bats and how to sort of deal with the problems they're facing and what to do about it. And those meetings, those conversations actually kickstarted the whole project. So what I'm going to tell you about today was sort of born in a conversation between Paul, David, me, and the community 2.5 years ago. But first of all, when most of us in Europe and the US think about Africa, this is what we think about. We think about the big charismatic mammals. We think lions, we think elephants. And those are the creatures why tourists come to many African countries. And we protect lots of habitats because of these animals. And that's valid. These animals are incredibly important to their ecosystems, but they're just a really tiny part of the ecosystems in African countries. And Africa's biodiversity is just so much more than these big charismatic animals. And what we need to do, and what we at BCI are very good at doing, is actually going out at night and looking closer and seeing what else we can see out there. And if you do that on the coast of Kenya, what you end up seeing are animals like this. So this is sort of a small representation of the unseen biodiversity of Kenya. This is just a really small part of Kenya's fauna. And all of these bats are present just along the coast of Kenya where we work. This is a very, very limited area, actually. And you can see there's so much diversity there already. All of these you can find there. So all of those occur in the three caves that we're going to talk about today. And all of that, like the bats I just showed you, occur in these caves. So you can just imagine the level of diversity you can actually find across Kenya, the country where there's so many different ecosystems and habitats, but then also across the entire continent of Africa. Like we are just scraping the surface here. And this is the star of the show today. So we're going to talk about our focus species, the Hildegarde's tomb bat. The Hildegarde's tomb bat is threatened, so it's currently listed as endangered on the IUCN Red List. And it only occurs, as far as we know, it only occurs along the coast of Kenya and Tanzania. But we haven't really been able to verify some of these Tanzanian occurrences in the recent past. So basically, we know of just a handful of caves where this bat is present in Kenya at the moment. And two of those caves harbor most of the population that we know of. So this is the focus bat. This is why we're there. This is what we're trying to protect, the Hildegarde's tomb bat. And how to recognize this bat? So first of all, it's insectivorous. That means it eats insects. It has, for a bat that eats insects, for me, this is a big bat, but some people might disagree. It weighs around the same 2 AA batteries would weigh. So it seems small, but there's so many bats that are so much smaller that for me, this is quite a chunky bat. Its wings are quite interesting. They're very light colored. They're nearly translucent if you have this bat in your hand. And they're shaped very narrowly. So they're very narrow and long wings, which means this bat probably flies very fast and very high. So it won't really try and hunt close to vegetation. It'll try and hunt out and fly fast and fly high to hunt its prey. So how do you recognize Hildegarde's tomb bat amidst all this diversity of bats that I just showed you? It has one very characteristic like detail on it. So this is a photo of a male's Hildegarde tomb bat. And as you might be able to see, it has this dark patch under its chin. And Hildegarde's tomb bat belong to a family of bats that have, how should we say it, interesting ways of attracting mates. So all sorts of species in that family have found out ways of making themselves and their surroundings smell good. I mean, I assume it smells good for bats. Some of the species actually have evolved little pockets in their wings where they store different smells that they find. And some of them have glands on their body that produce an oily secretion that is also used to mark themselves and to mark the females, to mark their territories. So this family of bat is very, very good at sort of finding ways of being stinky, which attracts mates to them. And Hildegarde's tomb bat is no exception. So they have an oily gland, the males have an oily gland under their chin, which then produces the secretion that makes it look like it is a dark fur patch. And we have Hildegarde's plushies on the way. So you can adopt a Hildegarde's tomb bat at one point from the BCI store. And we opted for actually giving them all this dark patch under the chin. So they're not smelly, thank goodness. But if you get one of the plushies, you actually know it is a male because you can see it has that dark, oily gland patch underneath its chin. And I'll be talking a lot about caves today as well. So I just wanted to give you a little impression of what the caves typically look like that you can find Hildegarde's bat in. So you can see they are quite open. They do have lots of chambers in the back. Some of them are very, very dark, but there are also very many open chambers with big holes in the ceiling. And these are coral stone caves. So they're very brittle, they break easily. And if you look closely at the picture, all the black dots on that ceiling of that cave, those are all bats. So even in those lighter areas, you can find a lot of different bat species. But the Hildegarde's tomb bats, they prefer the areas where it's a bit darker. So you can see walking into that cave, into the back, there's actually a dark spot. And this is where the dark chambers start. So just so you have a good picture in your head now, every time we talk about Hildegarde's tomb bat, you sort of know what the bat looks like. And every time I talk about a cave, you have a bit of an image in your head what those caves look like too. So it's this wide open coral stone caves that are packed full of bats. And this is a map of Kenya. So just to illustrate where we work. First of all, we work currently only along the coast because this is where you find Hildegarde's tomb bat. And we have two locations. One is a bit further north and one is very much in the south. And we will start today with the one location that is a bit further north, where you can find Kaboga and Makuru cave. Those two caves are very much located pretty much on the, not on the beach, but at the coastline. They're located in a city called Watamu, which is an incredibly big tourist hotspot, or at least the surrounding areas are. So one of the main problematics that we're facing in that area is actually development. So if I talk about development, this is what I mean. People buying land and putting buildings on it. So the picture you can see here is actually where the sign is in the middle of those two buildings. that is where the entrance of Kaboga Cave is. So Kaboga Cave is about just 3-4 meters behind that sign. And those two buildings were erected within the last year. So this can go incredibly, incredibly fast. And you can see in the background as well, there's lots of places that have been cleared of vegetation. Those plots of land have also been sold, and there's plans now to put buildings there as well. So just to illustrate a little bit what that looks like, when you drive to Kaboga Cave, this is sort of what you see. Lots and lots of building materials, lots and lots of clearing. This is really just a drive up to the cave entrance. And this is what it currently looks like behind Kaboga Cave. So it has been cleared. The vegetation is gone. People have bought this plot of land. And as far as we know, somebody is planning to build a hotel there. So what do we do about this? What can we do to protect the cave that is basically on very desirable land for building? And the reason why it's so desirable is because there is such a touristic hotspot, and land was relatively cheap until recently. So the prices have since soared, but it is still cheap enough to develop on and then make a profit out of the tourism industry in these areas. And Kaboga Cave is privately owned, and unfortunately the old landowner passed away and his children inherited the plot of land, and they immediately split it up and started selling off the different parcels to developers. This is why you can see the two buildings that were so close to the cave entrance. So when we arrived on the scene, Kaboga was for sale, and we swooped in just in time to actually purchase the plot of land that has Kaboga Cave on it. And that purchase was done in collaboration with our Kenyan partners. Angaza Vijiji is a Kenyan-based organization that we work with. The man sitting here is Everastus, who is a colleague and is working with us from Angaza Vijiji. And we managed to purchase the plot of land with Kaboga Cave on it and transferred the ownership to Angaza Vijiji now. So this parcel with that cave on is currently protected. It's under our ownership, and we're the ones who are managing it. That was basically the only way to protect that plot of land, because otherwise it would have just been sold off to the highest bidder. The cave would have been broken in and destroyed, the entire area flattened, and something else built on top of this. So there was no other way to protect this in this immediate pressure that this land and the cave was facing there. So right now, what we're doing is we are working on building a wall around the plot, because we have a big issue with trespassers at the moment. It's still very accessible. So the next step for us will be making sure that trespassing is no longer an option. And then long term, what we're working with Angaza Vijiji with is trying to make it a conservation and outreach site. So because Kaboga is a wonderful cave where you can actually see the bats emerge really well. So just going back here, like you can see the bats basically come out of this hole for about half an hour. So if you just stand outside Kaboga and when the sun is setting, you can see those bats fly out in big clouds. It's a wonderful thing to witness. And so long term, what we would like to see is have the site made into a conservation and outreach site, while it's protecting the cave and the bats inside the cave. So there's no trespassing, there's no disturbance, there is no destruction happening on this plot. The bats are protected, but we can still work with the community and working with the neighbors to sort of make this an area where people can learn about bats without harming them. So that's kind of the long-term plan for Kaboga, which has been secured now thanks to lots of donations as well that we got at BCI. So this has been pretty much a community effort from all of us. And then there's a second cave up in the north, and that cave is called Makuru. And Makuru is probably one of the most spectacular caves that are along the coast. So this is an insight from Makuru. You can see it's full of bats. It's very open. It has these wonderful like windows on the top of the ceiling that let in a little bit of light. And this situation with this cave is a little bit different. So it is currently based on community land. It's not privately owned. And the development hasn't quite reached that far there. But the community is concerned that that land might be grabbed by developers. So if it isn't owned officially, if a land is owned by the community and doesn't have any title deeds, it's quite easy for someone to fabricate title deeds or purchase title deeds, and then that land belongs to them, even though it was traditionally community land. And that is sort of the situation in Makuru Cave. So what we've been doing there is we've been talking with the community about how they would like to manage the cave and what they would like to see, like what is their vision for that cave and how they would like to protect it. And this is one of the first meetings that we had with them. So you can see David sitting on the right, discussing with community members whose parents officially have owned part of the land for a long time. So here the discussion is not so much protecting the parcel from development, but actually finding a way with the community to make sure that both the bats and the communities benefit from the site long term. So the discussions we're having with them right now is potentially who could take ownership of this cave, how could it be managed as a group, and also how could they benefit financially from managing the cave, for example, by sustainable tourism, or maybe using the plot as a communal medicinal plant garden. So these are the sort of discussions that we're having with them at the moment. They have been incredibly eager, and they have since registered a community-based organization. And I think the last thing I heard was they named it the Bat Eye, sort of as a nod towards protecting the bats. So the Makuru community is very eager to find a solution for that, to protect the cave, to make sure it's not developed on. But it's a very different approach than what we had at Kaboga Cave, where we really just had no other choice than buying the plot of land and protecting it this way. Here, we can work together with the people to make sure it's managed in a way that is beneficial to them and the bats. And that's sort of a high-level overview of what's going on in the north coast of Kenya. The other big location where we're working is at the very, very tip of the Kenyan coast, so the very southern tip. And there is a little village called Fikirini. And on the Fikirini lands are actually some of the most ancient caves and that have been used by the people there for centuries. So again, it is pretty much a community-based project. But the caves there happen to also be a very large roost of most of the bats that I've shown you at the beginning of this presentation. So not just Hildegarde tomb bat, but we have a lot of different species there. And the attitude of the people surrounding those caves, again, those caves have been used for centuries. And the attitude towards the bats were indifferent at best and negative at worst. So there wasn't much. They didn't necessarily see the bats as something positive. A lot of the traditional stories in Kenya surrounding bats are negative, have negative connotations. So there has been some active disturbance, some active trying to get rid of the bats. And that also was made worse during the COVID-19 pandemic when rumors were spread that bats were actually carriers. So that was kind of the situation when we came to the scene, was that they were trying to get rid of the bats, but there's just no positive attitude towards them. So the first thing we did in the Fikirini community was actually a lot of communicating. We communicated with them about the importance of bats, and we spent a lot of time there building trust and listening to the community needs and why their attitudes towards bats are the way they are, what they're trying to do about it. And what is most important is that actually we kept coming back. We kept coming back into this community to discuss with them and talk with them. And that was incredibly important because it showed them that we were committed to helping them and helping the bats find solutions to the current situation they were in. So that made a huge difference. And this is sort of one of the pictures of one of the first community meetings that David led. David is incredibly good at outreach, and he was talking to them. He's been talking to them for the past 2.5 years. And we were just creating a space for exchange and for finding solutions together. And that was the critical thing to do down in the south. Development isn't such a big problem here. You can see this is actually the surrounding environment to the caves. It's very different down south. Also, we're a bit further inland. We're not as directly at the coast as we are up north. So the pressure of that development pressure isn't here. But what you can see on this picture now, which will be important later, is there's also not much forest left. So it's pretty green, but it's mainly shrubland and some agricultural fields, and then not a lot of trees left in this area. The caves themselves are called the Three Sisters Caves. This is where it gets confusing because it's the Three Sisters Caves. There are actually 4 caves, and only 3 of them are used by bats. So it took me a while to wrap my head around it, but there are very big caves. They're very spectacular caves. They look similar to the pictures I've showed you before. The main cave, the big one, is actually only accessible with this wobbly construction there that keeps breaking and that we keep having to repair. Which is good and bad in its own right because it means not everyone can enter the cave, but I do tremble every time I have to climb down there. But once you are down there, the cave itself is pretty spectacular. Again, very open, lots of open spaces. There are some trees that are growing from inside the cave to the outside because there's been enough light coming in. It feels very calming to go in. So you could see, even as an outsider, you can see that has why it would have a lot of cultural value to these communities. And if you go in a bit further into the darker areas, this is sort of what you'll encounter. So all of these little light spots are bat eyes filmed in infrared in the dark. So all of these are fruit bats. They're the only bats that actually have eye shine when you film them. But they're not the only bats in there. There's just thousands and thousands of bats everywhere in these caves, in the corners, in the crevices, in the dark chambers, and even out in the light. Not all of the 4 caves are as difficult to access as the one I just showed you. This is actually the entrance of one of the other caves. So it's the other 3 you can just basically walk into. So there's no access restriction on them. And that is also, the caves are in community land. So there's no regulation who goes in or who goes out. And the 4th cave that I mentioned earlier is actually used by humans, by people from the religious leadership for religious and traditional rituals in there. So it has high cultural value and high spiritual value, that 4th cave. There are no bats in that one, but the caves themselves are actually seen as part of that structure, as part of something that is incredibly important to them culturally and traditionally. So the caves need to be accessible to people because they're used by people for important reasons. So how do you mitigate human cave use and bat cave use? Not all of the use is like non-threatening. So you've got a lot of people coming in and actually taking guano out of the caves. Bat guano is a very good fertilizer. So they do use it to fertilize the fields surrounding the caves. That in itself doesn't have to be a bad thing, but if it's done in a way that is disruptive to the cave and actually disruptive to the bats and detrimental to the cave, it can actually destroy a cave irreversibly. So guano harvesting needs to be done very carefully. You can see the guy in the back is actually doing something on the wall, which is very distracting to the bats. So this situation is also, it's not just accessed for cultural reasons, it's also accessed for agricultural reasons in this way. And that's besides people just coming into the caves and setting fires or having parties, which also happens. The biggest issue those caves are actually facing, or the bats are actually facing, is the deforestation surrounding the cave. So the forest is being chopped down. And again, we had to take a step back and see why that is happening. And it's happening because the community needs firewood for cooking. If you want to cook and feed your family, you need to have firewood or charcoal to do so. If you want to drink safe water that you have to boil, you have to have firewood to do so. If you want to build a door or a chair or a bed, you need to have timber to do so. The forests, so the trees have been cut down pretty consistently for the past 2 decades. And that's one of the things that Paul actually pointed out to us, is that how much he sees the forest being decimated every time that he visits those places. Now, the forest in itself is incredibly important because, for one, it's actually one of the sacred forests of the coastline. So it is considered a kaya forest, which is a sacred place, a community forest. But then also forests protect biodiversity. They provide food for the bats as the insect diversity remains high. They provide fruits for the fruit-eating bats. And importantly, for these really open caves that we have here along the coast, these coral caves with all these openings, the forest actually provides a stable microclimate. So you have all these trees surrounding these openings that provide a stable stability for the climate within the cave. So if the trees that provide shade are chopped down, the sun will penetrate the caves much more efficiently, which could be detrimental to the bats as well, especially if you have bats that are light sensitive, like the Hildegarde's tomb bat. So we need the forest and the landscape to remain intact to guarantee the survival of the bats in the cave. So that's one of the things we immediately started addressing. So what does that mean for our work? As you see, there are multiple powers at play here. So for one, the caves are used by humans for cultural reasons. The other thing is the caves are needed by the bats to survive. There are not a lot of caves left on the coast that are intact, that are protected from development. There's no way these bats could just move to another cave. So we need to find solutions, and we need to work with the community to find solutions. So we spent the last 2 years building trust with the Fikirini community. We were talking to them, we were providing a lot of education on bats, but we also fostered active exchange on what their needs are and how we could come together to address those needs in the way that the bats remain protected, but the community also benefits. And this is Evrastos, who I just showed briefly earlier when we were purchasing Kaboga Cave. He is the CEO of Angaza Vijiji, our partner organization in Kenya, and they are doing an incredible job at providing trainings in management techniques and sustainability techniques, in how to just be an efficient organization. Because one of the things that happened pretty immediately in the Fikirini community after we started talking to them about bats is that they took charge of their land. So the community came together and they established a community-based organization, so a CBO for short. And one of the first things they suggested after creating that CBO was to actually get the area surrounding the caves protected officially. And that was a really big deal because people were tried farming on that land. They had tried, they were chopping off the forest, they were chopping off down the forest for the wood. So to give that up for a conservation site was a big, big step. And that is something that they suggested to us that they could do. The people who tried farming on the land, it was not very successful because there's about this much topsoil on these coral caves. There's not a lot. It's not farming friendly area as is. So actually a farmer once came up to me and said that he's very happy to give up trying to farm on there because first of all, it's community land. And secondly, he feels like he would benefit more from a different approach to protecting the site than actually trying to grow corn on it. So there was a lot of discussions. And they designated the site as a bat conservation area. And they're currently working with the National Museums of Kenya to get legal protection as a cultural site. And this will actually be the very first protected area in Kenya designated to bats. So this would actually be a first in Kenya and possibly in Africa. The second step to sort of designating the area as a protected area was also to start restoring it. And so that this conservation site has the forest restored that has been chopped down. And we did get specialist partner organizations involved, in this case, the Leaf Charity, who is Kenyan-based, and they help community groups and train them in setting up tree nurseries and how to reforest according to the local ecosystem and also how to grow their own seedlings. So we've provided them with lots of trainings, and the long-term idea here is to not only restore the site, but to actually establish a tree nursery that can provide seedlings to surrounding conservation projects. So there's a lot of reforesting, restoration going on in this area in general, and people actually struggling to get trees to plant. So the community has also suggested that they grow trees and seedlings for other conservation projects that they can then purchase, which would be a way for them to actually gain economically from also restoring their own land. So that's a pathway that we're currently going down with them, and hopefully building the first tree nursery there by early next year. So because they got trained so well in how to plant trees, they made us plant trees. So they taught us how to plant trees properly, what you need to take care of, how you put the tree in the ground that it actually has a good chance of surviving. And here you can see Paul doing that very well. So we've planted quite a few trees ourselves every time I'm there. I get to plant some trees with them. And they've been incredibly busy. So just to give you an indication how committed this community is to restoring the site, this was the very beginning of them planting trees. They selected the area they wanted to restore themselves. They selected the trees they wanted to plant themselves. There were some trial and errors. So the first couple of trees they planted were actually eaten by baboons. Apparently they chose a species that has very nutritious roots that the baboons then dug up immediately. But those things take some trial and error. So now they've selected the correct tree species, the tree species that the baboons don't necessarily find too delicious. And just to give you an indication, this is what it looked like in the very beginning, and this is what it looks like now. So this is the exact same site. So there was nothing there. And then by now it's become a shrubland with thriving saplings. And it is incredible to be there. They've also organized themselves really efficiently. They come up with this uniform. We did not provide this to them. Like we ended up providing it, but we did not suggest it. They came up with it. They're incredibly eager and motivated. You can see lots of young people involved. They want to grow their skill set. They want to get skills and obtain knowledge on how to make a better future for themselves and the community as well. So this is part of the volunteer group who's been taking charge of the trees and the restoration, who've been trained in restoring and are being trained in how to manage a group properly at the moment as well. The community-based organization wanted their own logo, so they've asked this young local artist to design it. We digitized it for them. The original design that the young man is holding says Popo ni Rafiki. That means bats are friends in Swahili, which I think is a very, very important message. In the final logo, they ended up going with the local dialect, and as far as I'm aware, it says bats are animals with many benefits. So that's also something I thought was incredible. And this logo now, I mean, we have t-shirts and they want it on the letterhead at the moment, so they're working on that. The word popo, by the way, is important. It means bat in Swahili. Remember that for later. And we also try and sort of celebrate all the achievements with this community regularly, because even we've only been there for a relatively short amount of time in terms of conservation projects. Conservation projects take a long time. So this is not something that will be solved immediately. We're very committed to staying with this community for as long as it takes. But for the very short amount of time that we've been working with them, lots and lots of milestones have already been reached. And because of the commitment of the community and the trust that they have in us, that we can empower them to find a path to the future, where both they and the bats are better off. So we do have community celebrations regularly where local groups, they recite poems that they made up, they sing and dance about songs about bats. There was a theater play once about the importance of bats controlling malaria-carrying mosquitoes, which I really enjoyed. So these things are also very much a wider community activity. While we might be working with this group or that group, we have activities where the wider community is involved as well. So where does this leave us now? So first of all, the Three Sisters Caves will be legally protected very soon. Like I said before, we are working with partners to make that happen, to make sure that under Kenyan law, those caves are protected and cannot be used for any other purpose than a protected site. They cannot be developed on, they cannot be trespassed upon, etc. So creating the conservation area, BCI is committed to helping the community protect the site and the species. But all the while this is happening, while the legal things are in the works, that we're also providing lots of training in management and sustainability. We're also providing them with possibilities for green enterprises. So what that means is, I mentioned the tree nursery before. So they will be able to sort of grow their own trees, to restore their own conservation area, but also have the possibility of selling trees and selling plants that they grow in the tree nursery to other people, to other organizations to gain a bit of income. So that would be a way of getting money, something we call a green enterprise. We're also working on developing energy efficient stoves. So they have been developed, but we're also trying to adapt that structure here on the coast of Kenya. So stoves to cook water, to cook food that need less firewood. So that would immediately reduce the pressure on the remaining trees in the area. And there are also plans of sort of helping the farming population there, trying to figure out how to potentially grow agroforestry systems, so systems that can use trees as well as crop plants to be a bit more efficient in farming. Because like I mentioned before, the land itself doesn't really promote itself for the type of farming that's currently being done, which is mainly growing maize. So this is why we're working with quite a few different partner organizations. We're working with the university, with Angaza Vijiji, with the National Museums of Kenya, because this sort of project needs a very holistic approach. You can't tackle this just from one direction only. You need to have the expertise on the team to make sure the needs are met and the solutions are found in accordance to the community's wishes. So we can't just focus on the bats. I know we're a conservation organization, but most of conservation if not all of conservation, is actually working with people and working with them closely, trying to find out the drivers behind what's happening to the animal you're trying to protect, and then coming up with solutions together with the people who are involved. Otherwise, you don't have sustainability in any conservation project. So our hope is that in the future, the important kaya forests, these sacred sites, are protected for the people, for the generations to come, so they can continue valuing the caves as cultural heritage, but also learn to protect them for their ecological value as well. From our side, we are committed on walking that path with them for as long as it takes. We're going to be there for the upcoming years. But at the same time, we'll also be looking along the coast of Kenya and Tanzania to find some more caves like this, because we want to know if the species is still where it's traditionally been recorded and down in Tanzania. We want to make sure that the main caves of the species, the main roosters, are protected, because it's key that we can actually protect habitat across the entire range and not just a handful of caves. So we're hoping that we'll find some more cave roosts of Hildegarde's tombbat along the coast. And if not, it's even more important to protect the ones that we know of right now. So it's a bit of a parallel approach, making sure that the ones that we know of are undisturbed and provide a safe haven for the spat species, while trying desperately to look for other caves as well. So overall, the way we work, and especially work in Kenya, is we want to make sure that the bats survive in the human-dominated world. And for that, we need the collaboration from everyone, from the community, from the partner organizations, and from us, from the researchers, from the students, from the general public. And I think the primary school group summed this up best. Again, I hope you remembered the word popo, the word for bats, because they made up a little song about bats, and I have a little clip for you here.
Let's come together and conserve the bat. Let's come together and conserve the bat. Let's come together and conserve the bat. Popo ya koko ala maembe pekee, huyu ndiye popo ala maembe pekee, kazi yake kutupatia koko ala maembe pekee. Popo popo ale alea, popo popo ale alea, popo popo ale alea, huyu ndiye popo ala maembe pekee, kazi yake kutupatia koko ala maembe pekee. Huyu ndiye popo ala maembe pekee, kazi yake kutupatia koko ala maembe pekee. Huyu ndiye popo ala maembe pekee, kazi yake kutupatia koko ala maembe pekee. Popo popo ale alea, popo popo ale alea, popo popo.
So that was the primary school highlighting the importance of bats and why we should protect them.
Yes.
And with that, I think we can all come together and conserve the bats. If you want to help, we do have a QR code and the link you can follow here if you want to get involved. And that would be all from me. So I would like to thank you all for listening. And don't forget, bats are friends. Popo ni rafiki.
Awesome. Thank you, Isabella. Yeah, so like she said, if you'd like to help BCI with the work we're doing in this project and save Hildegarde's Toombat, you can scan the QR code or visit batcon.org/donate/Kenya to help out. But for now, let's get to some questions. So let's see what we've got here. Ray has asked if there's any requirement or expectation for construction companies in Kenya to establish biodiversity and any threats like that before construction starts.
Not that I'm aware of. I don't think local, so what I know from a few other countries, local companies aren't, but international companies that want to build in the country might have to provide an environmental assessment before. But as far as I know, here at least along the coast, there's no regulations for that.
Got it. Julie asked, has BCI or any of the community groups in Kenya worked with organizations like Solar Cookers International to prevent deforestation for firewood?
So there's loads of different groups in the whole area, even along the Kenyan coast. This particular community that we're working with, they have not had the opportunity to work with organizations like that. So they have been incredibly, in the beginning, surprised that we kept coming back, but they told us that we're the only organization that came back more than once. So in this particular community, no, but there have been quite a few projects like this along the coast with different communities.
Okay. Michael asked, are heavy forests natural? Like where the after picture of where it was becoming shrubland, is that what it should look like, or is that kind of an in-between phase?
That is a very good question. So that's something that's constantly debated when you're doing reforestation. And there's obviously, for example, if there are elephants in the landscape, there won't be a forest like this anyway. So it's a little bit of a tightrope walk to figure out at what point, what level of restoration you should be doing. But in this particular area, there has been forest for a very, very long time, and that has been chopped down very quickly. So if you look at satellite images for the last 3 or 4 decades, you can actually see it decimating very fast. And now you have mainly shrubland left. So in this particular area, you should have a sort of dryland forest at this point in time.
Okay. And a question from Mark. So I know the trees that they're planting now, they can be used for selling for other groups, but will they also be grown for the firewood and the timber for building all those things, all the things that they were using the trees for before?
That is sort of the discussions we're having right now, how to best manage that, because that would make the most sense. It's just a question of where to grow those trees to the size that they would need them for these activities, because especially native trees don't grow very fast. So firewood trees, etc., are normally trees that are introduced into areas. Anything that grows very fast, eucalyptus is very common, but we don't want that being grown in the conservation site. So we're currently trying to figure out that what kind of plants they're going to start growing in the tree nursery, and then if they want to grow their own firewood, for example, where they could do that in different areas. So that's a discussion we're having with them, but it would definitely be a very good possibility.
Okay. Ray had another question. Is there a source of fresh water inside the caves?
There's no real source. It's so close to the coastline that any water in the caves is salty. And that is sort of the issue for the entire area. So there's a couple of boreholes towards the coast, and those have to be, the salt has to be extracted from it. I don't know the English word right now. But the groundwater there has still very high levels of salt. So even if it does rise in the cave, which is the case for one of the caves, I think, it's not the freshest. Also, I wouldn't recommend using water from bat caves. There's lots of guano in it.
Yes, I can imagine. I think there's just one left. We also got a question on what frequency do the bats echolocate in? Is that something you'd know?
All of these species have different frequencies. So unfortunately, I don't know them from the top of my head. There's something we can look up very quickly, but all of these species are very different. So it's quite easy to tell them apart from echolocation calls as well, which is quite nice. And also traditionally, or at least before Paul found the species with the highest recorded echolocation calls in one of those caves, unfortunately, it's a very, very sensitive species. So it seems to have moved out. But it's quite interesting to see what you can do with bioacoustics there, because you can find out a lot of species.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I also wanted to bring up, Isabella, you had mentioned that there's a new Hildegarde's tomb bat plushie on the way, and actually it was listed live in the website this week. So if you would like your own Hildegarde's tomb bat, and to support this project and Bat Conservation International, just go to shop.batcon.org. That's shop.batcon.org. And they're right on the front page there, front and center, and ready to come home with you.
Good. They're not stinky, we promise.
Yes. All right, so that's it then. So thank you so much for educating us about Hildegarde's tomb bat and the challenges they're facing. To our audience, if you want to protect Three Sisters Cave, you can make a donation by visiting batcon.org/donate/Kenya. Lastly, you can stay in the know by subscribing to our email newsletter on batcon.org. So any final words for us, Isabella?
I think I'm good. Thank you so much for listening. That was fun.
Yes, of course. And thank you so much for joining us all the way from Austria. So that is all for now, everybody. Thanks for caring about bats, and we'll see you at the next Bat Chat. Bye, everyone.